Whitakers Chapel. This church was originally an Anglican church, and then it became a Methodist Protestant church in 1828. This group of people out here disagreed with the fact that it was only the bishops who were members of the conference. Lay people could not be members of the conference. So it was the bishops who ruled the church. And this was a bunch of people that didn't like that idea at all. And so they withdrew from the Methodist Church and formed their own church, the Methodist Protestant Church. And it was alive and well in this area until 1939, when unification came. Unification between the Methodist Protestant Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Methodist Episcopal Church. So it's kind of neat. I think I would have agreed with those people in that day and time. I wouldn't have liked for the bishops to have made my decisions either. There was not enough congregation to support it as a church, and it was closed. In 1960-something, Mr. Waldo Whitaker, a descendant of Richard Whitaker, who was the original giver of ground for the Whitakers Chapel, funded a restoration of this church, and it became a shrine in United Methodism. The organ is the original pump organ that was played in my lifetime, in her lifetime, by Miss Jewel Whitaker, who lived across the road from this church. One of my fond memories of that organ is when Lily, my sister Lily, married Robert Norman. The organist for that wedding was a classmate named Grace Beavans. That was B-I-V-I-N-S, and no relation to Sam. Grace was one of these wonderful people who was so wrapped up in her music, and she was playing so beautifully, but she forgot that the organ had to be pumped or no sound would come out. And as she got more and more involved in the music, she pumped slower and slower, and it became less and less obvious that she was playing something. And then she realized what she had done, and she played faster, so the music came louder. Every wedding needs a good story, and that's one of the ones that we have of Lily's wedding. The other story has to do with the door through the Sunday school room. This church has only two doors, and they are at the front of the church. There's no entrance to the back part of the church. But on either side of the altar, there are two small doors that lead into two tiny rooms that must have been Sunday school rooms. And he was in his dress uniform, and he and his father, Dr. Nicholson, who was wearing his tuxedo, climbed a ladder to get into that little room, so that when Lily came down the aisle, Robert and Dr. Nicholson could magically appear at the altar. Those are some of the best memories I have in this chapel. One other that concerns a sad occasion. When our grandmother died, Lily Montgomery Whitaker, she had lived with us for all of my lifetime. And I came out to stay with Aunt Jewel in her house across the road for that weekend of the funeral. And she and I came across to the chapel to open it up for the funeral procession and for the family and for the mourners. And I sat on that front bench with Aunt Jewel. Unfortunately, I sat on a wasp. So I was crying for real. This organ is a recent addition to the chapel. It is owned and was rebuilt by Charles Harris, who plays it for any of the services that are held here. It was the organ in the Methodist Protestant Church in Enfield, which was 2 doors from my home. Mother was the organist. The pipes that show above the organ were not a part of it when it was in the Methodist Protestant Church. I think Charles thought that would put a nice finishing touch to the organ down here, but the organ itself Its construction, it is electrified. Its construction and the way it is played was the same when Mother played it. This was not just a Whitakers church. It was named Whitakers Chapel because Richard Whitaker gave the land for the original church, and many of the families were the members of this church. But many of the families who lived up and down this road, the Lawrences, the Cullums, the Bakers, the Knights, the Stallions, were members of this church also, and their ancestors are buried in Whitakers Chapel. This is my mother and daddy, Nina, that's where I got my name. Nina Vincent Whitaker and Hubert Mahaney Whitaker. Now, my brother is named Hubert, and I'm named Nina, so that's where that comes from. One other grave on this plat, that of John Curtis Thompson III. This is Emma and Kurt's son, Curtis, who died in 1952. He had cancer. This is the path that leads to the cenotaph for John Whitaker, Colonel John Whitaker. He was a colonel in the Revolutionary War. He is not buried there, but the tombstone was placed in his memory. I'm not sure who placed the tombstone, probably the Daughters of the American Revolution. But when I was a child, our bathtub one time was filled with red roses. And we made ropes of roses, and all of us Whitaker children stood on either side of this path and held the roses while something happened. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I think it has to do with that tombstone down there, with that cenotaph. Wilson Carey Whitaker is the oldest occupant of this cemetery. He died in 1851. Wilson Carey Whitaker was the son of Colonel John Whitaker, one of 8 children who had families who lived in this area and who we are the descendants of. Wilson Carey Whitaker had a son named Ferdinand Hannon Whitaker. Ferdinand Hannon Whitaker had a son named Wilson Carey Whitaker. Wilson Carey Whitaker had a son named Hubert Mahaney Whitaker, who was my father, and Em and Lily's father, and Hubert and Wilson's father. But notice, Wilson Carey Whitaker's wife was Lily Montgomery Whitaker. And she was a Whitaker before she married a Whitaker. Lily Montgomery Whitaker was the daughter of Lawrence Baker Whitaker, who was the son of Dr. Carey Whitaker, who was the son of Colonel John Whitaker. So now we have two limbs off of the John Whitaker tree. The Beavans family has another limb. Let's go over here to John Beavans, Sr., who was born in Portsmouth, Virginia, and who was the first Beavans to come into Halifax County. He met Margaret Green Whitaker, who was the daughter of Absalom Benton Whitaker, who was also the son of Colonel John Whitaker. Margaret Whitaker's tombstone is the tall obelisk beside Sam. Absalom Benton Whitaker is not buried in this cemetery. He had gone to Florida on some adventure or some business, and he died there. And John Beavans was his executor, and we have a copy of his account book for those years, around 1844 45, 46. And he was taking care of the farm and the notes and the financial affairs of Absalom Benton Whitaker. And I noted last night when I was looking through it that there is a reference to $7.50, which he paid for a casket. Now, he doesn't say that that casket was for Absalom Benton Whitaker, but all of the expenses in that particular part of that account book were concerned with the death of Absalom Benton Whitaker.